To understand the monsters of H.P. Lovecraft, you don't need to look at the stars. You need to look at the man. Howard Phillips Lovecraft is revered today as the father of cosmic horror. The idea that the universe is vast, uncaring, and filled with entities so terrifying that seeing them drives you mad. But Lovecraft didn't write about fear because he had a vivid imagination. He wrote about fear because he was afraid of everything. He was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, into a world that was already crumbling. The Lovecraft family was old money that had run out of money. They were aristocrats living in a fading mansion, obsessively clinging to the past. The horror started early. When Howard was 3 years old, his father, Winfield Lovecraft, had a psychotic break in a hotel room in Chicago. He claimed he was being persecuted by secret enemies and that the chambermaids were assaulting him. He was dragged away in a straitjacket and locked in Butler Hospital for the insane. He remained there for 5 years until he died of general paresis, a polite term for late-stage syphilis. Little Howard was raised by his mother, Susie, and this is where the true nightmare begins. Susie Lovecraft was a woman consumed by grief, neurosis, and a terrifying need for control. She was terrified that Howard would inherit his father's madness. She suffocated him. She wouldn't let him play with other children, claiming they were lower class and dirty. Worse, she psychologically abused him. She would touch his face and tell him he was grotesque. She told him he was so ugly that he should hide from people so he wouldn't scare them. She called him hideous. Imagine a child being told by the only person he loves that he is a monster. It is no coincidence that in Lovecraft's stories, the protagonists often discover they are related to monsters, the deep ones, the outsider. He was writing about himself. Lovecraft grew up as a recluse. He barely attended school, spent his days in the family library, reading 18th century books and astronomy texts. He wanted to be an astronomer, but he failed. Why? Because he couldn't do the math. When he encountered complex calculus, he had a nervous breakdown. He couldn't handle the abstraction. This failure haunted him. It reinforced his belief that the universe was too complex for the human mind to understand, a core theme of Cthulhu. But his nights were worse than his days. From the age of 6, he suffered from vivid, screaming night terrors. He claimed that faceless, black, winged creatures, called night gaunts, would snatch him from his bed and fly him over jagged alien peaks. He would wake up screaming, paralyzed. These weren't just bad dreams. They were the first draft of his mythology. As he entered adulthood, Lovecraft became a man out of time. He refused to acknowledge the 20th century. He dressed like a Victorian gentleman, wrote with a quill pen, and used archaic British spelling. He was a ghost, haunting his own life. He was afraid of the cold. He claimed that if the temperature dropped below 20 degrees, he would go into convulsions, likely psychosomatic. He was afraid of doctors. He was afraid of the sea. He hated seafood, describing it as slime. But his greatest fear, the fear that would fuel his most famous creations, is his fear of the other. Lovecraft was a virulent, pathological racist. This is the dark truth that many fans try to ignore, but we cannot. His racism wasn't just a character flaw. It was the engine of his horror. He was terrified of anyone who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. To him, immigrants were not just people. They were biological threats, swarming masses that would contaminate his pure bloodline. This paranoia kept him locked in Providence, safe in his bubble of privilege and poverty. But in 1924, something impossible happened. The recluse fell in love. And he made the biggest mistake of his life. He moved to New York City. The woman was Sonia Green. She was everything Lovecraft was not. She was extroverted, successful, a business owner, and she was Jewish. For a man who wrote anti-Semitic tirades in his letters, marrying a Jewish woman was a bizarre contradiction. But Lovecraft was a man of contradictions. He loved the individual Sonia, but hated the group. He moved into her apartment in Brooklyn, New York. For a few months, he was happy. But then, the walls closed in. Sonia's hat shop went bankrupt. She fell ill and had to move to Cleveland for work. Lovecraft was left alone in the Red Hook district of Brooklyn. For a man with severe agoraphobia and xenophobia, 1920s New York was hell on earth. It was loud, crowded, and filled with immigrants from every corner of the globe. To you and me, This is the vibrant melting pot of America. To Lovecraft, it was an apocalypse. He walked the streets of Red Hook, terrified. He saw the faces of strangers, Italians, Syrians, African Americans, Asians, and his racist mind transformed them into monsters. In his letters, he described the crowds as squat, swarthy strangers with hardening faces and narrow eyes. He described them as vile, semi-human, fermenting. This hate is disgusting, but psychologically it is important, because this hate gave birth to Cthulhu. Lovecraft channeled his revulsion for the melting pot of New York into his fiction. In his stories, the horror often comes from mixing humans breeding with fish creatures, deep ones, to create a hybrid race. The cult of Cthulhu is always depicted as a mix of mongrel races chanting in swamps. The great old ones, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, as a Thor metaphors for the city that was crushing him. They are vast, indifferent, and they don't care about you. New York didn't care about Lovecraft. He was starving. He was stealing the cat's food to survive. He was rejected by publishers. He felt like an ant being stepped on by a giant. So he wrote a mythology where all humans are ants. This is the core of cosmicism. Before Lovecraft, horror was about good versus evil. A vampire is evil, a priest is good. If you have faith, you win. Lovecraft changed the game. In his universe, there is no good or evil. There is only scale. Cthulhu isn't evil. He doesn't hate you, just doesn't know you exist. You are a bacteria on his boot. If he wakes up, you die simply because he stepped on you. This was Lovecraft's experience of the modern world. The universe was cold, mechanical, and indifferent to his suffering. While living in this misery in New York, he wrote his most famous works, including The Call of Cthulhu. He poured all his anxiety, his feeling of insignificance, and his fear of the unknown hordes into these stories. But the city broke him. In 1926, Sonia begged him to join her in the Midwest or let her start a business in New York again. He refused. His pride was too brittle. He couldn't be supported by a wife, and he couldn't work a regular job. He famously turned down a job as a clerk because he said, "A gentleman does not work in a trade." He was starving, wearing shoes with holes in them, eating expired beans. But he clung to his identity as a gentleman of Providence. He chose poverty over the reality of the 20th century. Defeated, he fled New York and ran back to the safety of his aunts in Providence. He left his wife behind. They divorced shortly after. He had failed as a husband, failed as a provider, and failed as a man. He retreated back into the shadows, back to the grave of his ancestors. Back in Providence, living with his elderly aunts, Lovecraft entered his final and most creative phase. He was now a complete recluse, rarely leaving the house before sunset. He became the old gentleman, a strange figure seen wandering the graveyards at midnight. But while his physical world shrank, his mental world expanded. He began to correspond with a circle of young writers: Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, Robert Bloch, author of Psycho, and others. He wrote over 100,000 letters in his lifetime, more words than all his stories combined. In these letters, we see a different side of him. He was generous, kind, and a mentor to these young men. He encouraged them, edited their work, and built a community. He was the grandfather of modern horror, building a network of writers who would keep his mythos alive. But he was still poor, dirt poor. He lived on $15 a week, which was low even then. He ate primarily beans, cheese, and canned soup. His malnutrition caught up with him. In 1936, the suicide of his best friend, Robert E. Howard, devastated him. Howard shot himself in the head when his mother slipped into a coma. Lovecraft was shaken. He felt the darkness closing in. Then the pain started. It was a gnawing pain in his gut. Lovecraft, being afraid of doctors, ignored it. He dubbed it indigestion and kept eating beans. By the time he was forced to go to the hospital, it was too late. It was cancer of the small intestine. His death was slow and agonizing. He spent his final weeks in the Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, keeping a diary of his own death. He approached it with scientific detachment, documenting the pain levels and his fading consciousness. His last words were reportedly about his fascination with the process of dying. "I am sometimes painfully interested in this phenomenon called death." He died on March 15, 1937. He was 46 years old. At the time of his death, H.P. Lovecraft was a total failure. He had never published a book. His stories were only printed in cheap pulp magazines like Weird Tales, which were considered trash for teenage boys. He died penniless, believing his work would be forgotten within a year. He was buried in the family plot, but his name wasn't even on the tombstone. It just listed him along with his parents. He was invisible. But the universe, in true Lovecraftian fashion, had one final twist: a cosmic joke. After his death, his friends, the young writers he had mentored, refused to let his work die. August Derleth and Donald Wandre founded a publishing company, Arkham House, specifically to print Lovecraft stories in hardcover. They saved him from oblivion. Slowly, over decades, the world caught up to Lovecraft. We realized that he was right. Science advanced, as we discovered black holes, dark matter, and the vast freezing emptiness of space. His cosmic horror stopped looking like fantasy and started looking like prophecy. Today, H.P. Lovecraft is one of the most influential writers in human history. Stephen King, Guillermo del Toro, Alien, Stranger Things, Prometheus, Batman Arkham Asylum, they all owe their DNA to the shy, racist, neurotic man from Providence. His face is on t-shirts, plush toys, and video games. The man who was afraid of everything has become the face of fear itself. But there is a tragedy in this triumph. Lovecraft died thinking he was worthless. He was a prisoner of his own mind, trapped by phobias, bigotry, and a paralyzing fear of life. He created monsters with 1,000 eyes, but he couldn't look his own neighbor in the face. His life teaches us a dark lesson. The greatest horror is not the tentacled beast rising from the sea. The greatest horror is the cage we build for ourselves. Lovecraft built his cage out of racism, fear, and pride, and he died inside it. The monsters were never real, but the fear was the only thing that was true.